Hello, I'm Jennifer Wells, core faculty in the Transformative Studies program at CIIS, and I'm going to talk about trauma. The problem statement is that trauma poses a catch-22. People who are traumatized tend towards behaviors that block the healing of that very trauma. People who are traumatized need social support and a chance to share and talk about what's going on, but tend instead to think obsessively, to go numb, even to go into denial, and to isolate themselves. Recent research shows how neural networks in very traumatic moments tend to be singed into certain patterns. Neurons that fire together wire together. Traumatic wiring tends to create patterns of both locking the person into obsessive thinking that re-triggers the traumatic feeling and can keep someone in that brain state. From that traumatized neuronal wiring, because of partly the singeing effect, it can be hard to switch back to healthier brain states. I've identified 3 specific tendencies in trauma response that map onto 3 possible general areas for apps that could be designed to help to address and resolve these problems. People going through trauma reactions tend to these 3 things: obsessive thinking, shock, and isolation. First, they tend to, with obsessive thinking, they conflate or fuse the symptom and the story. So there's a physical symptom like backache or heart palpitations, and then there's the story, which is often usually thinking about the trauma, obsessively, worrying, which tends to keep people in that state. Secondly, they go into shock, they freeze up, and it involves often becoming incoherent, not thinking well, so that even very educated people can tend to forget successful self-care techniques that they even know and use at other times. And thirdly, people tend to isolate and cut themselves off socially, even otherwise sociable people, right when they most need social connection. So I'm an interdisciplinary sociologist. I focus on complexity and rapid social change. I'm not a psychologist, but actually this interdisciplinary lens is very helpful, considering that trauma is actually a very widespread, very multifaceted phenomena, unfortunately, in US society today. So a few more details on the nature of trauma. As I go through some of these details about trauma and the symptoms and the coping strategies, keep in mind that these are all things that apps could facilitate or mobilize to help support people. So many people, or most people, experience trauma at some point in some form in their lives. Regardless of its source, an emotional trauma has 3 common elements. It's unexpected, the person is unprepared, and there is nothing that the person can do to prevent it. We tend to think commonly of various kinds of psychological traumas. Natural disasters are one that we commonly think of: earthquakes, fires, floods, hurricanes. And of course, with climate change and the increase in extreme weather, these are becoming more common and larger, so this is an important category. Also, physical assault is a common association, including rape, incest, molestation, domestic abuse, and a variety, and accidents. But I think what's really interesting also is what we don't always immediately associate with psychological trauma, more overlooked categories that are actually, start to think about it, very common. So even a fall or a sport injury, losing a job, losing a close relationship, a serious illness, emergency surgery, these kinds of things can also be traumatic. Not necessarily and not for everybody. So what determines whether something is traumatic, it depends on individual experience of the event. But for some people, it can be surprising and even embarrassing to discover that a job loss or an accident or the loss of a close friend can be debilitating, and it's actually somewhat common. So let's break it down a little bit. So physical symptoms, there's actually a long list. I'm not going to name all, but it's interesting to look into. aches and pains. These can be all kinds: headaches, backaches, stomach aches, sweating, heart palpitations, but also other categories like sleep patterns, appetite, libido, and a lot more. Emotional reactions is even a longer list, and I'm going to name just a few, but thinking about all of them can help to bring to light just how pervasive trauma can be. Again, the tendency to isolate oneself, feelings of detachment, and rationalizing this. So concern over burdening others with problems. Emotional numbing, restricted range of feelings, difficulty trusting, and again, even people that don't always have that difficulty. Fear, anxiety, grief, hyper alertness, hypervigilance, irritability, mood swings like laughing and then crying. So a lot of things that seem to fall within a range of normal at other times. And again, worrying or ruminating about the trauma itself. However, we are at a good point in history. We've been studying trauma more deeply since 1980. And in the last 3 decades, there's a lot of understanding about responses to trauma that work for many people. So we now have lots of information about coping strategies. So a primary one is the social support system. Connecting with others, especially connecting with empathic listeners, and where it's possible, people who have also gone through the same trauma. So creating support networks around common experiences. For many people, some form of hard exercise like jogging or dancing, relaxation like yoga or massage, humor. I'm sure the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup has cured many people in the last century from a bad mood, and also flipped people out of negative thinking patterns. For some people, prayer and meditation. For many people, listening to relaxing guided imagery, progressive deep muscle relaxation, bubble baths. The list is really very long. Of course, diet and sleep cycle, and avoiding stimulants like caffeine, sugar, nicotine, but also commitment to something meaningful. Something really personally meaningful and important can also reorient and help to refocus somebody. Simple things like hugs, including pets. We now understand the biochemistry of much better. Specific foods, like, and again, a long list, but things like warm turkey or baked potatoes have tryptophan activators, so can make people feel tired but good, like after Thanksgiving dinner. And the list goes on. There are some therapies reputed to work well, like it's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing has been found to work really well, so an app could also tie in with a well-proven therapy. So again, all of these coping strategies are things that that an app could facilitate or mobilize. So I'm just going to go real quickly over these 3 categories I mentioned and thoughts about solutions for each category. Again, the 3 categories are obsessive thinking, shock, and isolation. The first is people conflating or fusing a symptom in a story. So one approach would be a game or an app that would help to separate, remind people of the separation between the physical response and the ideas or worries about it. Anything that names the physical response, anxiety, stress, fear, etc., reframes the experience and can serve to de-link the symptom in the story. So you could have an app that would remind someone to reframe their reaction. And we've all experienced this to varying degrees, right? So it's not the end of the world, and we could throw in lots of facts about some of the new sciences that show, what's really going on. It's not the end of the world. This is just a passing temporary chemical sensation. Some kind of funny message could help cheer the person up and sort of snap them out of a certain kind of thinking. The second category, again, was going into shock, freezing up, becoming incoherent. So You might set something up, there might be sort of a two-stage process, for example, where when people are in a calm, coherent state, they can maybe fill out questionnaires or consider what self-care is effective and comforting for them. Could be given lots of options like the ones we talked about earlier. And then later, when they're in a traumatic situation, if they can just link to this, they can be reminded of their own list of self-care options. Go take a bubble bath, or go jogging, or call a friend. Can be just what someone needs to snap them out of a certain state of mind. And the third category was to isolate, to cut themselves off. When people are panicked or in a traumatic situation, then they can be helped even just in connecting with their own social support network, or with other kinds of meetups. Just ordinary socializing is what most people need. And furthermore, as far as social networking sites, this could add potentially a more humane, multifaceted face to sites that are sometimes critiqued as just being superficial. Thank you.